This is the Dollemore Daily, and I'm Jesse Dollemore. The Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is a coalition that works toward the goal of a more open and just society. By fighting and advocating for equality and justice in areas related to immigrant rights, criminal justice reform, policing, economic security, education, fighting hate and bias, and also related to the very core of our democratic process, voting rights. Look, I know that sometimes this information isn't sexy. It doesn't contain flashy headlines, and it doesn't blow your mind with Trump's ridiculous antics. But it is maybe the most important thing that any of us will talk about or think about on any given day, because if voting rights are allowed to be deliberately eroded, we will end up with more diseases like Donald Trump, end up with more treacherous demagogues who appeal to and invigorate the worst among us. So stick with me here as I lay this out, because it is vitally important that you are armed with the most up-to-date information related to what the opposition is up to in their ongoing attempts to stifle your voice in our democratic process. The Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights just released a deep dive study that they've entitled Democracy Diverted. A study that has uncovered a deliberate attempt at modern-day voter suppression on a scale not seen since before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was necessary because prior to the Voting Rights Act, Black voters were intentionally and systematically prevented from participating in the political system through the use of literacy tests, poll taxes, voter intimidation tactics, and brutality in the form of physical violence. The Voting Rights Act provided sweeping reform of the historic systems of racial discriminations related to voting in the United States, especially Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. You see, Section 5 applied to specific jurisdictions where some of the most egregious civil and voting rights violations had been carried out. Under the Voting Rights Act and Section 5, these jurisdictions, which were largely all across the Jim Crow South, were restricted with something called a pre-clearance requirement. Since historically they couldn't be trusted to administer the democratic process fairly and/or justly, they were required to get approval from the federal government before instituting any changes to their voting systems. And if the United States Attorney General or the U.S. District Court for Washington, D.C. determined that those changes weren't discriminatory, they could go ahead with them. In addition to pre-clearance, there were federal examiners assigned to register voters and observers who monitored the entire process. Section 5 was the seminal turning point for voting rights in the United States, the positive results of which are undeniable. After the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Black voter registration rates in the former Confederate states exploded from 30 percentage points below white registration rates in 1960 to equal or greater than that of whites in 2010. And Black voter turnout in elections matched those results. The Voting Rights Act was instrumental in transforming America into a true representative democracy. In 1965, there were only 5 African Americans in the House of Representatives and the Senate combined. Today, there are almost 60. And when you look at state and local offices nationwide, that effect is even more stark. Since 1965, African Americans went from holding fewer than 1,000 offices across the country to over 10,000. That is why protecting and extending the vote is so vitally important to our country. Conversely, this is why Republicans are hell-bent on rolling back voting rights and suppressing the vote in populations they view as undesirable, thus dragging us back to a time before the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And they got their moment to do just that when in 2013, a county in California brought a case before the Supreme Court challenging elements of the Voting Rights Act. Nope, just kidding. Of course, it wasn't a California county that was attempting to overturn the Voting Rights Act. It was Shelby County, Alabama. As a result of this 5-4 ruling, the conservatives on the court gutted the Voting Rights Act, leaving the Section 5 preclearance system inoperable, which opened the door once again to racial discrimination in our electoral processes. In her dissenting opinion on the case, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote, "Throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet." In 2013, she clearly saw what was to come only a few short years later, because since the Shelby decision, the number of states and localities all over the nation, but especially in the South, that have attempted to suppress the vote in black and brown communities has skyrocketed. From the Democracy Diverted report, states have shortened voting hours and days, enacted new barriers to voter registration, purged millions of eligible voters from the rolls, implemented strict voter identification laws, reshaped voting districts, and closed polling places. This is a numbers game for these states that are attempting to accomplish their goal of suppressing the vote. And it has evolved from an insipid attempt to try to keep blacks from the polls into the casting of a much wider net, intended to keep young people, minority populations, and the poor from making it to polling places. And here's why. According to Nate Cohn from the New York Times, it is commonly assumed that Democrats benefit from higher turnout because young and non-white and low-income voters are overrepresented among non-voters. And for decades, polls have shown that Democrats do better among all adults than among all registered voters, and better among all registered voters than among all actual voters. So Republicans in the states I'm getting ready to talk about are making the calculation that by restricting the vote, more Democrats will be discouraged from voting than their own voters. And the kind of vote restriction we're going to talk about is the closing of polling stations, the shuttering of the actual place that someone goes to vote, meaning that there are fewer places to vote in any individual county and state, leaving the ones that remain overburdened and saddled with long lines, which greatly discourages participation. You'll likely not be surprised to learn that the vast majority of the states in question that have closed hundreds of polling stations are located in the South. Also, it should come as no surprise that when all of these tactics were employed, Republicans held the office of the governor. Let's start with the three worst offenders and then discuss the rest. Texas. Texas is a state where 39% of the population is Latino and 12% is African American. Texas has closed 750 polling places since the Shelby ruling, by far the most of any state in the study. 5 of the 6 largest closures of polling places are in Texas. With 74 closures, Dallas County, which is 41% Latino and 22% African American, is the second largest closer of polling places, followed by Travis County, which is 34% Latino, Harris County, which is 42% Latino and 19% African American, and Brazoria County, which is 13% African American and 30% Latino, tied with Nueces County, which is 63% Latino. Without Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, it cannot be assessed the impact these mass closures have on communities of color. Arizona. Arizona is a state where 30% of the population is Latino, 4% is Native American, and another 4% is African American. It has the most widespread reduction in polling places. Almost every single county, 13 out of their 15 counties, closed polling places since preclearance was removed. Some on a staggering scale. Maricopa County, which is 31% Latino, closed 171 voting locations since 2012, the most of any county studied and more than the 2 next largest closers combined. Many Arizona counties shuttered significant numbers of polling places, including Mojave, which is 16% Latino, Cochise, which is 35% Latino, and Pima, which is 37% Latino. And Georgia. Let's talk about Georgia, a state where 31% of the population is African American and 9% is Latino. It has 214 fewer polling places. Georgia stands out because its counties have closed higher percentages of voting locations than any other state in the study. The top 5 closures of polling places by percentage were Georgia counties. The top 3 counties in the state were Lumpkin, Stevens, and Warren, which is 61% African American. Bacon County, which is 15% African American, and Butts County, which is 28% African American, are tied with 80% closed. 7 counties with major polling place reductions now have only 1 polling site to serve hundreds of square miles. In a February 2015 memo, the office of Brian Kemp, who was then serving as Georgia Secretary of State, he's now the governor, encouraged counties to consolidate voting locations. He specifically spelled out twice in bold font that as a result of the Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision, counties are no longer required to submit polling place changes to the Department of Justice for pre-clearance. What do you think was on his mind there? And of course, there are a slew of other states that have severely limited the number of polling places in a naked attempt to suppress the vote of Black and Latino Americans. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, among others. I will leave you with some of the conclusion from the study, which is linked below for you to read for yourself. Next to the ballot itself, the most identifiable element of our democracy's voting process is the polling place. It should and it must be accessible to all. When it is not, the barriers to participation can be high. Moving or closing a polling place, particularly without notice or input from the local communities, disrupts our democracy. It can mean the choice between picking up a child from school or voting, taking needed overtime or voting, or taking a bus across town or voting. In a truly inclusive democracy, no one is forced to make these difficult decisions. While there are justifiable reasons for closing polling places, the sheer scale of closures we've identified since Shelby, coupled with other more nakedly racially discriminatory actions to deny voting rights to people of color, demand a response. The federal government must scrutinize these closures, especially in states and localities formally covered, justifiably covered by Section 5. Listen, thank you very much for sticking around to the end of this with me. What I've just talked about is critical for the future success of our country. If you found some value in the research and the facts that I just laid out, I would invite you to support my work as an independent creator right here on YouTube by clicking that join button to become a channel member. You can pick your level of support, which starts at less than $2 a month, and take part in some of the rewards like stickers and members-only community tab discussions. But more importantly, you can know that you are helping in a very real way to support independent media just like this. If only 1% of my audience clicked that join button, I would be completely untethered from concern about YouTube's policies and demonetization. Anyway, I really hope you'll consider it. Thank you very much. I appreciate you.